She arrived in Kansas with $11, a ruined suitcase, and a name that meant nothing anymore. A bankrupt widow. A society woman reduced to scrubbing pots for a man who barely spoke. But Josephine Sterling was hiding something nobody in that dusty little town could have imagined. A mind sharp enough to bring down a banker, hands steady enough to save a dying calf in a midnight blizzard, and a heart brave enough to rebuild an entire life from the ash of a lie. This is not a story about a woman being rescued. This is a story about a woman who walked into the fire and came out forged in iron. If that sounds like a story worth staying for, hit that like button, leave a comment telling me what you think she'll do next, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe. Because every week we tell stories about people who refuse to stay broken.
The clock ticked loud, heavy. Like a hammer striking wood, Josephine Sterling sat in the leather chair, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Across the mahogany desk, the St. Louis lawyer wouldn't meet her eyes. "Debts, Mrs. Sterling," he mumbled. "Massive ones. And, well, there is another family, across the river. 18 years of marriage erased." Just like that, she didn't cry. Crying was for women who still had something left to lose. "How much?" Joe asked. Her voice didn't shake. "Nothing remains. You have the clothes on your purse and the $11. A one-way ticket west. St. Louis faded into coal smoke. Kansas. Louis faded into coal smoke. Kansas stretched out, endless, and on her ticket. A place where nobody knew the great, esteemed Judge Sterling, or his bankrupt, humiliated widow." The train hissed to a stop. Dust. That was the first thing read, suffocating dust swirling across the wooden platform. Joe stepped down. She held one heavy calfskin suitcase. Inside were her mother's silver combs, 3 silk dresses, a velvet cloak, the absolute last anchors to a dead life. The station was loud, men shouting, iron clanking against iron, then a different sound. A sharp, wild scream. A draft horse, spooked by the sudden shriek of the train whistle, snapped its tether. It reared up, thrashing the air, blind, rolling panic. It lunged forward, charging straight toward the edge of the platform, right where a little girl stood, 9 years old, maybe. Frozen in absolute terror. Time slowed down. People yelled. Nobody moved. Joe didn't think. Instinct took over. She held her entire world in her right hand, that calfskin suitcase. Her safety net, her past, her class. She let it go. It hit the dirt. She didn't look back at it. She launched herself forward, her expensive silk skirts tearing against the rough wooden planks. She hit the girl hard, wrapped her arms tight around the small body. They rolled off the platform together, tumbling down into the choking red dirt. A massive shadow blotted out the sun. The horse thundered past, its heavy iron shoes striking the exact spot where the child had stood a second before. Silence. Then a collective exhale from the crowd. Joe tasted copper and dirt. She looked down. The little girl was shaking, her small hands clutching Joe's ruined silk bodice. "You're all right," Joe breathed, smoothing the girl's dusty hair. "You're safe." Heavy boots hit the ground, rushed, desperate. A man pushed through the crowd, tall, shoulders like an axe handle, skin baked by the Kansas sun. He dropped to his knees in the dirt. His large, rough hands ran over the little girl's arms, her legs checking for broken bones with practiced efficiency. "Abigail," he said. His voice was rough, gravel and worry. The girl sobbed, burying her face in his neck. He held her tight. Slowly, he looked up. His eyes met Joe's, piercing, calculating. There was no easy warmth in his stare, just a hard, pragmatic assessment. He looked at Joe's torn, expensive dress, her bleeding palms. Then he looked up at the platform. The heavy leather suitcase had been trampled. The brass clasp was smashed. Silk spilled into the mud. "You threw away everything you owned for a kid you don't even know," he said. Joe wiped the dust from her chin. She looked at the ruined bags, then back to him. "A leather box is just a box, mister. It has a price," Joe said, her voice steady and clear above the murmur of the crowd. "But a human life? That has value. I've spent 41 years surrounded by high society folks who couldn't tell the difference between the two. I'm done making that mistake." The man stared at her. A muscle flickered in his jaw. "I'm Elias Thornton," he said. "And this is Abigail." Joe stood up. Her legs wobbled, but she locked her knees. She brushed the dirt from her ruined skirt and looked him dead in the eye. "I read the paper on the train, Mr. Thornton. You need a cook at your ranch." "I need a job." He looked her up and down at the ruined St. Louis finery, the soft hands that had just bled for his daughter. "You know how to cook, lady. It was a test. Not about the stove, about survival." "I can learn," Joe said. "I need a roof. You need hands. Isn't that enough to start?" Elias Thornton didn't smile, a silent recognition of a kindred, stubborn spirit. "Gather what's left of your things," he said, turning toward a wagon hitched near the depot. "We leave in 10 minutes. The wagon springs groaned, wood rubbing against iron, a steady, rhythmic complaint against the rutted Kansas dirt. Joe sat stiff on the wooden bench. The wind here didn't blow, it pushed. It carried the smell of dry sage and distant rain. Abigail was fast asleep. Her small head resting heavy against Joe's side, the child's fingers were still curled tight into the fabric of Joe's torn silk skirt. Elias Thornton drove. He to speak. He didn't need to. He handled the reins with an easy, unconscious grace, a man perfectly built for a hard world. Joe watched his hands, calloused, sun-baked, capable. They rode for an hour. The town of Oakhaven faded into an empty, sprawling sea of amber grass. Then the ranch appeared, Thornton Ranch. It sat in a shallow valley, a two-story farmhouse built of thick weathered timber, a massive red barn, fences that stretched out like geometric webs across the prairie. It was sturdy, it was defiant, but as they drew closer, Joe saw the edges of neglect paint peeling, a garden swallowed by weeds, a porch that hadn't been swept in a month of Sundays. It was the home of a man who worked from dark to dark just to keep the roof up. A house surviving, not living. Elias pulled back on the reins. Whoa, the wagon settled. Abigail stirred, blinking against the late afternoon sun. On the front porch stood a boy, 16 maybe, tall, skinny, but with the broad shoulders of his father starting to fill out under a faded cotton shirt. His arms were crossed over his chest. His jaw was set hard. "Pa!" the boy called out. His voice was cracking, caught somewhere between a child's whine and a man's bark. He looked at Joe, his eyes narrowed. "Who's she?" Elias stepped down from the wagon. He reached up, lifting Abigail down to the dirt. Then he turned to Joe. He didn't offer his hand. He waited to see if she could step down on her own. She did. Her knees ached, but she kept her spine straight. "This is Mrs. Sterling," Elias said, his voice flat, carrying across the yard. "She's the new cook. Mrs. Sterling, my son Matthew." Matthew didn't uncross his arms. He looked at Joe's ruined dress, the mud on her hem, the bruised, pale skin of her hands. "We don't need a cook," Matthew spat, "especially not some fancy city lady playing pretend. She looks like a stiff breeze would break her in half." "Matthew," Elias didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He just said the boy's name. It sounded like a heavy wooden door slamming shut. Matthew's jaw clicked shut. He looked away, kicking at a loose floorboard. "Inside," Elias said. The kitchen was large, practical. A massive cast-iron stove dominated the far wall. The countertops were clean but cluttered, harness leather waiting to be oiled. A rifle broken down for cleaning, coffee mugs stained black at the bottom. Elias pulled a chair out at the heavy oak table. He pointed at it. Joe sat. He walked to a shelf, pulled down a worn leather ledger, and grabbed a stub of lead pencil. He sat across from her. The man didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You saved my girl today," Elias said. "I owe you for that. But a debt of gratitude won't cook the meals, and it won't wash the linens. This is a working ranch. Everybody pulls their weight, even the dog." "I didn't ask for charity, Mr. Thornton," Joe said. "Good, because I ain't offering any." He opened the ledger. 3 meals a day. Breakfast before the sun's up. Laundry on Mondays. Mending when the clothes tear. Joe nodded. "I understand. For that, I'll pay you $15 a month, room and board included." Joe blinked. $15. Back in St. Louis, a full-time experienced housekeeper in a fine mansion might make 10. 15 was a foreman's wage, a man's wage. From the doorway, a chair scraped hard against the floor. Matthew had been lingering in the hall. He stepped into the kitchen, his face flushed red with sudden anger. $15, Matthew practically yelled. "Pah, we barely got the cash for the new seed order. You're gonna pay a lowly servant the same wage as a ranch hand?" She saw a woman. A ruined one from the looks of it. She should be begging for scraps, not taking a man's pay. The silence that followed was suffocating. Joe felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, the shame, the instinct to shrink down, to apologize for taking up space. It was the same tone her husband's creditors had used. "You are nothing without the man who backed you." Elias stood up slowly. He didn't look at Joe. He looked dead at his son. He walked around the table. Matthew took a half step back but held his ground. "Matthew," Elias said. His voice was low, rumbling in his chest. "Listen to me closely, because I am only going to say this once in your life." The boy swallowed hard. "A person's dignity," Elias said, pointing a thick, calloused finger at his son's chest, "lies in their willingness to work with their own hands. It does not matter if those hands are holding a plow, swinging a hammer, or kneading dough in this kitchen. No honest labor is lowly." He stepped closer, forcing Matthew to look him in the eye. "Only the man who despises another's hard work is lowly. Only a coward looks down on someone who is trying to survive. She is doing the work. She gets the pay. You judge a person by their character and their grit, boy. Not by what they wear, and sure as hell not by whether they are a man or a woman. Do you understand me?" The words hit the room like thunder. Joe sat frozen. For 18 years she had been a decorative piece, a judge's wife, a silent partner in a hollow marriage. She had never not once heard a man speak about a woman's labor with such absolute unyielding respect. Matthew stared at his father. His chest heaved. The anger was still there, but the arrogance had been shattered. "Yes, sir," Matthew muttered. "Go check the water troughs," Elias said. Matthew turned and bolted out the back door. Elias walked back to the table. He sat down. He didn't look flustered. He didn't act like he had just delivered a grand speech. He just picked up the pencil again. "Now," Elias said, looking at Joe, $15. But there's a condition. "Which is?" Joe asked. Her voice felt remarkably steady now. "My Abigail, she's smart as a whip, but the schoolhouse is 5 miles away, and the teacher left town 2 months ago. You speak like a woman who has read a library. You carry yourself like one." Elias tapped the pencil on the table. "You teach her to read proper. You teach her numbers. And—" He paused, looking down at the heavy ledger. "I can read a trail, Mrs. Sterling. I can read the weather. But I look at these columns of numbers the bank sends me, and my eyes cross. You help me audit the books at the end of every week. Make sure we aren't getting cheated." Joe stared at him. He wasn't hiring a maid. He was hiring a partner. "You trust a stranger with your financial ledgers?" Joe asked. Elias met her gaze. His eyes were the color of slate, hard and clear. "I saw you throw away your life savings for a kid you didn't know," Elias said. "I trust you. Do we have a deal?" He slid the book across the table. Joe looked at the worn paper. She picked up the pencil. It was heavy in her hand, heavier than the silver tea sets she used to pour from. She signed her name, Josephine Sterling.
"Deal,"
she said. 4 in the morning. The farmhouse was silent, pitch black. The Kansas cold seeped through the floorboards, biting at Joe's bare feet. She stood in the kitchen, holding a single oil lamp. The shadows danced against the walls. In the center of the room sat her enemy, the stove. It was a massive cast-iron monarch, black metal, heavy. It smelled of old grease and wood ash. To Elias Thornton, it was a tool. To Joe, it was a sleeping iron dragon. Back in St. Louis, she had pulled a velvet bell rope, and a maid named Clara had brought her hot tea and scones. Joe didn't even know how to light the fire, but a deal was a deal. $15 a month. Room and board. Dignity. She set the lamp down. She knelt on the cold floor. She grabbed a handful of kindling from the wood box, stuffed it into the firebox, struck a match, dropped it in. Smoke billowed out immediately. Thick, acrid, stinging her eyes. She coughed, waving her hands. The flame choked and died. She tried again. More wood, another match, more smoke. Her knuckles scraped against the iron door, skin peeled back. Blood welled up, bread against the black soot coating her hands. She bit her lip to keep from cursing. Heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs. Elias walked into the kitchen. He was already dressed for the day. Canvas trousers, suspenders, a flannel shirt rolled up to his thick forearms. He smelled of soap and cold air. He stopped, looked at the smoke filling the room, looked at Joe kneeling on the floor, her hands smeared with blood and ash, a desperate, angry tear tracking down her soot-stained cheek. The old Joe, the judge's wife, braced for the condescension. She waited for him to sigh, shake his head, push her aside, and say, "Let a man do it." She waited for the pity. Elias didn't sigh. He walked over to the dry sink, poured a cup of water, and took a drink. "Draft's closed," he said, his voice gravelly with sleep. Joe stopped rubbing her eyes. "What?" "The draft handle, on the side." He pointed with his chin, not his hands. "You got it shut tight. Fire needs air to breathe. Same as us. Open the flue, lay the kindling in a crosshatch, leave space in the middle. Then strike your match." He didn't kneel down. He didn't take the match from her. He gave her the knowledge, and he expected her to use it. Joe turned back to the stove. She found the small iron lever on the side, pushed it. She pulled out the messy pile of wood, restacked it exactly as he described. Left a hole in the center. Dropped the match. The wood caught. A bright, cheerful flame licked upward. The smoke vanished up the chimney. Heat began to radiate from the iron. "Coffee's in the tin on the top shelf," Elias said. He grabbed his coat from the peg by the door. "Biscuits and bacon will do fine for breakfast. We'll be in from the barn in an hour." The Jor sat back on her heels. The fire crackled. Her hands throbbed. But staring into that orange flame, a strange, fierce pride bloomed in her chest. She had built a fire. It was a small thing, a tiny, insignificant thing, but it was hers. An hour later, breakfast was on the table. It wasn't pretty. The biscuits were hard on the bottom and doughy in the middle. The bacon was nearly burnt black. Elias, Matthew, and Abigail sat at the table. Joe stood by the counter, holding a dish rag, her stomach tied in knots. Matthew picked up a biscuit, knocked it against the wooden table. It made a dull thud. He looked at his father, waiting for the explosion, waiting for Elias to fire the useless city woman. Elias picked up his biscuit. He broke it in half. He dipped it into his coffee to soften it, put it in his mouth, and chewed. He swallowed. He looked up at Joe. "Hot," Elias said, "and it fills the hole." "Thank you, Mrs. Sterling." He went back to eating. That was it. No praise for a bad meal, but no condemnations for a first try, just acknowledgement of the effort. Matthew scowled, but he started eating too. Abigail smiled at Joe around a mouthful of burnt bacon. The real test came the next day. Joe was preparing to bake bread. The flour sack, a heavy 50-pound canvas bag, was kept on the highest shelf in the pantry to keep it away from mice. Joe was 5'4". The shelf was at least 6 feet high. She stood on her tiptoes. Her fingers barely grazed the bottom of the sack. She dragged a heavy wooden stool over, climbed up. The stool wobbled. She grabbed the pole, lost her balance, and came crashing down. Flour exploded everywhere. A white choking cloud. Joe sat on the floor, covered head to toe in white dust, rubbing her bruised elbow. Elias walked past the kitchen doorway. He stopped. He looked at the stool. He looked at the white dust covering the floor, the walls, and the cook. Their eyes met. He didn't laugh. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He just gave a slow single nod and kept walking out to the yard. Joe wanted to scream. She spent 2 hours sweeping up the mess. The next morning, Joe walked into the kitchen at 4 a.m. She lit the stove. No smoke this time. She walked into the pantry to get the coffee tin. She stopped. The high shelf was gone. She looked down. A new shelf had been built. Thick, fresh-cut pine wood. It was exactly 3 inches lower, perfectly positioned at shoulder height for a woman who was 5'4". The flour sack sat squarely on it. Joe reached out and touched the raw wood. The sawdust hadn't even been swept away yet. Elias had been up late. He hadn't made a speech about it. He hadn't pointed it out to show what a good man he was. He saw a barrier in her way, and he quietly dismantled it in the dark. Joe rested her forehead against the cool canvas of the flour sack. For the first time since her husband died, a single tear slipped down her cheek. Not from grief, from the overwhelming weight of being truly seen. Later that afternoon, the kitchen smelled of yeast and roasting beef. Abigail sat at the heavy oak table. In front of her were a slate board, a piece of chalk, and 3 empty canvas flour sacks. "All right, Abby," Joe said, wiping her hands on her apron as she walked over. "Show me what we have." Abigail chewed her lower lip. "We have 3 sacks. Good. Now your father is fencing the north pasture. He needs to divide that land into 4 equal pens for the calves. If these 3 sacks are the pasture, how do we make 4 pens out of them?" Abigail frowned. She picked up her chalk. She drew 3 squares on the slate. She drew a line down the middle of each. "Half," Abigail said. "If I cut them in half, I get 6 pieces. That's too many." "So what do we do?" Joe asked, her voice calm, encouraging. I don't know. Girls don't need to know land math, Matthew says. He says girls just need to know how to measure fabric for dresses. Joe stopped. She placed both hands flat on the table and leaned down, looking right into Abigail's bright blue eyes. "Abigail Thornton," Joe said softly, but with steel underneath. "Numbers do not care if you wear trousers or a skirt. A quarter of an acre is a quarter of an acre. If you can measure fabric, you can measure land. If you can measure land, you can own it. You understand me?" Abigail's eyes went wide. She looked at the flour sacks. Then she looked down at her slate. She erased the halves. She started dividing the 3 squares differently. "Quarters," Abigail whispered. "If I cut all 3 into quarters, I have 12 pieces. And if I want 4 equal pens, each pen gets 3 pieces, 3/4 of a sack." Joe smiled, a fierce glowing pride warming her chest. "Exactly. You just divided fractions, Abby." Outside the open kitchen window, Elias stood perfectly still. He held a broken bridle in his hands. He had been walking to the barn to fix it when he heard the voices. He listened to the St. Louis lady tell his 9-year-old daughter that she had the right to measure the world, that she had the right to own it. Elias looked down at his rough, scarred hands. Then he looked up at the window. He didn't go inside. He didn't interrupt. He just turned and walked toward the barn. But as he walked, his back was a little straighter. The heavy, invisible weight he had carried for 5 long years felt just a fraction of an ounce lighter. Saturday. Town day. The wagon rolled into Oakhaven just past noon. The sun sat high and mean in a cloudless sky. Heat off the tin roofs. Joe sat beside Elias on the buckboard. She wore a simple calico dress she had borrowed from a trunk of clothes Elias' late wife had left behind. It was a little loose in the shoulders, a little tight in the waist, but it was clean and it wasn't silk. Oakhaven wasn't a large town, 1 main street. A bank built of heavy brick, a saloon, a mercantile, a livery stable, and a restaurant called the Silver Spoon, which tried very hard to be something it wasn't. As the wagon rattled past the bank, the stares began. They weren't subtle. Out here, people didn't have the time or the manners for subtle. Men on the boardwalk stopped whittling. Women carrying market baskets paused mid-step. They looked at Elias, then they looked at Joe. Word had traveled, it always did. The bankrupt widow from St. Louis, the ruined woman, working as a cook for the grieving Elias Thornton. Joe felt the weight of those eyes. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It reminded her of the parlor rooms back east, the hushed whispers behind velvet fans. Did you hear? Her husband had a mistress, left her with nothing, penniless. She kept her chin level. She stared straight ahead at the horse's ears. Elias didn't look at the crowd. He didn't seem to care. He pulled the team to a halt in front of the mercantile, set the brake, wrapped the reins. He climbed down. He walked around to her side. He offered his hand. Joe looked at it, a large, rough hand, in front of the entire town. She took it, stepped down. "We need flour, sugar, coffee," Elias said, his voice carrying over the sudden quiet of the street. "And a new slate for Abigail. You pick it out, put it on my tab." He didn't hand her a coin purse. He gave her the authority of his name. Joe nodded. "I'll see to it." Inside the mercantile, it was cool and dark. It smelled of peppermint, oiled leather, and tobacco. Joe handled the ledger. She checked the prices. The clerk, a nervous young man, tried to overcharge her for the coffee by 2 cents a pound. Joe didn't yell. She didn't cause a scene. She simply placed a manicured finger on the open ledger book. "The freight tariff dropped last month," Joe said softly. "By 3%. If you charge Mr. Thornton this rate, you are either ignorant of the law or you are a thief. Which is it?" The clerk swallowed hard. He adjusted the price, implicit value right there. She was protecting Elias' labor, guarding his sweat and blood with her intellect. An hour later, Elias found her outside. He was carrying a sack of nails. "Hungry?" he asked. "A little," Joe admitted. Elias nodded toward the silver spoon. "They serve a decent beef stew." He started walking. Joe followed. But as they approached the swinging doors, she hesitated. She knew the rules. Even out here, hired help didn't eat in the dining room. Foremen ate in the kitchen. Maids ate in the wagon. "Mr. Thornton," she said, "I should wait by the horses." Elias stopped. He turned around. He looked at her. "Did you load the wagon?" he asked. "Yes." "Did you negotiate the price of the coffee?" "Yes." "Then you earned a hot meal, and you won't eat it in the dirt." He pushed the doors open. He stood aside, waiting for her to enter first. The dining room was crowded. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and stale perfume. The moment Joe stepped inside, the dull roar of conversation died. Forks hovered over plates. Silence fell like a dropped anvil. Elias walked past her. He found an empty table right in the center of the room. He pulled out a chair. He looked at Joe. Every eye in the room was on them. Joe walked over. Her legs felt like lead, but she sat. Elias pushed the chair in. Then he took his own seat across from her. He didn't flinch. He didn't glare at the room. He just picked up the menu. "Two stews," Elias said to the pale waitress who had scurried over. "And hot coffee." Silence dragged on. Slowly, the murmurs started up again, like a swarm of angry bees. Then, a shadow fell over their table. Joe looked up. Silas Vance. He was a large man, but soft. A man who ate well and didn't sweat for his meals. He wore a silk of fish and a gold pocket watch chain that rested on his round stomach. He was the bank. He was the land. He was Oakhaven's self-appointed king. Beside him stood his wife Margaret, thin, sharp-featured, wrapped in a shawl that cost more than Elias's wagon. "Elias," Silas boomed. A fake, hearty sound. "Things must the room. You must be picking up at the ranch. Things must be picking up at the ranch." "Things are fine, Silas." He didn't look up from his coffee cup. Silas chuckled, a cold sound. He turned his small, dark eyes to Joe. "And this must be the new help from St. Louis, I hear. My. It's a long fall from the judge bench to a cast-iron stove, isn't it, Mrs. Sterling?" Elias set his cup down. The ceramic clinked hard against the saucer. "You got business with me, Silas. State it. Otherwise, you're blocking my light." Silas held up his hands in mock surrender. "Just being neighborly, Elias. In fact, I was going to make you an offer again. My price for your north pasture still stands. You sell to me, you might not have to rely on discounted labor." "The land ain't for sale," Elias said. Margaret Vance stepped forward. She looked down her nose at Joe. She looked at the calico dress, the worn collar. "It is a tragedy," Margaret said. Her voice was loud enough for the whole room to hear. "What happens to a woman when her husband fails her? Left with no name, no home, no value, reduced to scrubbing pots for a widower. A woman without a husband and its protection is truly a pitiful thing." Joe felt the sting. The old familiar poison. She looked at Elias. His jaw was clenched tight, was about to defend her. She reached across the table. She placed her hand over his. Just for a second, a silent command. "Let me." Joe stood up. She wasn't wearing silk. She didn't have pearls around her neck, but she stood with the posture of a woman who had dined with governors. "Mrs. Vance," Joe said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. It carried perfectly across the silent dining room. Margaret blinked, taken aback by the direct address. "You speak of value," Joe said, smoothing her apron, "as if it were a coat I left behind in Missouri. Let me correct you." Joe stepped away from the table. "A woman's worth is not a piece of jewelry for a man to wear when it suits him, or pawn when he goes broke. It is not tied to the name of the man she marries, and it is certainly not lost when that man proves himself weak." Silas S.'s smile vanished. Margaret S.'s face turned the color of boiled milk. "My value," Joe said. The knuckles were bruised. The skin was rough from lye soap. "Lies in my mind. It lies in my ability to stand on my own 2 feet when the ground crumbles beneath me. I am proud of these hands, Mrs. Vance. They are dusted with flour, not deceit. They feed me. They earn my keep. They belong to me." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the gossips, the stares of the men. "I am a cook. I am an honest worker, and I sleep far better at night now than I ever did and built on lies." Joe sat back down. She picked up her napkin, unfolded it, placed it in her lap. "The stew is getting cold, Mr. Thornton," she said. Elias stared at her. His chest rose and fell in a slow, deep breath. Then the corner of his mouth twitched. a tiny, almost invisible smile. "Yes, ma'am," Elias said. Silas Vance stood frozen, humiliated by a servant, dismissed by a failing rancher. He grabbed his wife's elbow and dragged her out of the restaurant. The dining room remained perfectly, absolutely quiet, except for the sound of Elias and Joe eating their stew. Equals. The wind howled, a low, mournful sound rattling the glass panes of the kitchen window. It was Tuesday, 3 days since the trip to town. The tension from the restaurant had followed them back to the ranch, settling into the dust of the yard. Joe was kneading dough, push, fold, turn. The rhythm was hypnotic. It quieted her mind. The back door slammed open. The wind rushed in, bringing a swirl of dry dirt. And Matthew, he didn't look like a 16-year-old boy. He looked like a casualty of war. His bottom lip was split wide open, dripping thick, dark blood onto his chin. His left eye was already swelling shut, turning a nasty shade of purple. His flannel shirt was torn at the shoulder. His knuckles were raw and bleeding. Joe dropped the dough. "Matthew," she gasped. Grabbing a clean towel from the counter, Matthew jerked away from her. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, chest heaving. "Don't touch me," he snarled. The words were slurred through his split lip. Elias came down the stairs, heavy boots on the wood. He took one look at his son and stopped dead. The anger was immediate, a flash of lightning in a dark room. "What happened?" Elias demanded. Matthew didn't answer. He stared at the floor, breathing hard. "I asked you a question, boy," Elias said, his voice dropping into a dangerous low rumble. "Who did this to you, Tommy Vance?" Matthew spit. He wiped his mouth, smearing the blood across his cheek, and two of the ranch hands from his father's place. Elias stepped forward. "You fought 3 grown men?" "They were talking," Matthew yelled, sudden tears of rage springing to his unswollen eye. "Down by the livery, laughing, saying things." "Saying what?" Elias pressed. Matthew looked at Joe. The anger in his eyes wasn't directed at her anymore. It was directed at the world, saying that Pa was a fool, saying that the new cook was nothing but a St. Louis whore who got kicked out of her own bed, saying Pa only brought her here because he was desperate for a warm body. The silence in the kitchen was heavier than the iron stove. Elias didn't yell. He didn't move. He just stood there. The muscle in his jaw throbbed. The quiet, deadly stillness of a man deciding how much violence he was about to unleash. Joe felt sick, but she pushed it down. She had to. She walked over to the dry sink. She pumped cold water into a tin basin. She grabbed a bar of carbolic soap and a clean rag. "Sit down," Joe said to Matthew. "I don't need sit down," she repeated. Not a request. A command, spoken with a cold, absolute authority that made both Matthew and Elias blink. Matthew shuffled to the chair and collapsed into it. Joe wrung out the rag. She stepped up to him. "Look up," she said. Matthew hesitated, then tilted his head back. Joe didn't flinch at the blood. She didn't make soft, comforting noises like a mother. She moved with ruthless, terrifying precision. She cleaned the split lip with a single firm swipe. Matthew hissed in pain. "Hold still," she ordered. She pressed her thumbs gently along his jawline, checking for fractures, moving up to his cheekbone. "Does this hurt when I press?" "No." "Here?" "A little. No bone is broken. But that cut on your eyebrow needs stitches, or it will scar blind." Elias watched her. He watched her hands. They were steady, quick, the hands of a tradesman. "I'll get the whiskey," Elias said, turning toward the cupboard. "No," Joe said sharply. "Whiskey thins the blood. He'll bleed more. Boil water. And bring me my sewing kit from upstairs." Elias stared at her for a half second. Then he nodded. He moved to the stove. For the next 20 minutes, the kitchen became a clinic. Joe sterilized her needle. She threaded it with black silk. "This is going to burn," Joe said. "I ain't a baby," Matthew muttered. Joe didn't smile. She took the first stitch. Matthew gripped the edges of the chair until his knuckles turned white, but he didn't cry out. He took it, implicit action. She was fixing what the town had broken. She was taking the boy's pain into her own hands and sewing it shut. When it was done, Joe tied off the knot. She snipped the thread. She wiped his face clean one last time with a cool rag. "Drink this," she said, handing him a cup of water. Matthew took it. His hands shook slightly. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the cold ache of the beating. Elias stood by the window watching the dark clouds roll in. "Why did you fight them, Matthew?" "They were insulting our house, Pa," Matthew said softly. "They were insulting the Thornton name." Joe turned away to wash her hands in the basin. The water turned pink. "You're angry," Joe said, scrubbing the soap into her skin. "Yeah, I'm angry," Matthew shot back. "They insulted you!" Joe stopped scrubbing. She dried her hands on a towel. She turned around and leaned against the counter. She looked at the beaten, bruised boy. "No, Matthew," Joe said gently. "You're not angry because of me. You didn't fight those men because they insulted a stranger who burns the biscuits." Matthew looked down at his boots. Joe walked over. She knelt in front of him, bringing herself down to his eye level. "You're angry because everything is changing," Joe said. Her voice was a soft, steady rhythm in the quiet room. "You're angry because 5 years ago your mother died. and the world just kept turning like it didn't matter. You're angry because your father brought another woman into this house, and you are terrified that if you let me cook for you, if you let me sew up your face, it means you are replacing her. A single tear cut through the dirt and dried blood on Matthew's uninjured cheek. He furiously wiped it away with the back of his hand. Don't, Joe said, catching his wrist. Men don't cry, Matthew choked out, his voice cracking. Pa never cried, not once. Your father's silence does not mean he didn't bleed on the inside, Joe said fiercely. Listen to me, Matthew. Fearing change doesn't make you weak. Missing your mother doesn't make you weak. But hiding your true feelings behind your fists, letting other men's ugly words dictate your actions, that makes you weak. She squeezed his wrist. A man's tears do not strip away his masculinity. They prove he has a heart worth fighting for. Do not let this harsh world turn you into stone just because it's easier than hurting. Matthew broke. The tough, angry 16-year-old facade shattered. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with 5 years of unwept tears. Joe didn't hug him. She didn't crowd him. She just stayed on her knees, keeping her hand on his knee, anchoring him to the earth while the storm passed. Elias watched from the shadows. His own chest tightened. A dull, heavy ache he had ignored for half a decade flared to life. When Matthew finally quieted, he scrubbed his face with the towel. He looked at Joe. He looked at the neat, tight black stitches above his eye. Where did you learn to do that? Matthew asked, his voice thick. Cooks don't know how to sew flesh. Joe stood up. She carried the bloody basin to the back door to throw out the water. Before I married the judge, Joe said, her back to the room. I lived in Philadelphia. My father was a lawyer. He wanted a son. He got me. I used to sneak into his library at night. I read all his law books. I memorized them, and then I read his medical journals. She tossed the water out into the dirt. I wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer. I didn't care. I just wanted to use my mind. I apprenticed secretly with a local physician for 2 years. I learned how to set bones, how to stitch wounds, how to stop bleeding. She shut the door. She turned around to face them, and then my father found out. He burned my notebooks in the fireplace. He told me the law was not for women. Medicine was not for women. He told me my only job was to be a quiet, decorative wife. He married me off to a man twice my age in St. Louis the next month. Silence stretched out. You gave up, Matthew said quietly. Yes, Joe said. I gave up. I let them tell me what I was allowed to be. I was a coward. She looked at Matthew. Don't you be a coward, Matthew. Don't you let Silas Vance or those ranch hands or anyone else tell you what it means to be a man. Matthew nodded slowly. The anger in his eyes was gone, replaced by something new. Respect. Go wash your face proper, Elias said from the corner. Matthew stood up. He walked past Joe. He stopped for a second. Thank you, ma'am, he whispered. He walked upstairs. Joe leaned heavily against the sink. The adrenaline was leaving her, too. Her hands began to shake, just a little. Elias walked across the kitchen. He stopped right in front of her. He didn't say anything about the fight. He didn't thank her for stitching up his son. He didn't apologize for the things the town had said about her. He knew words were cheap right now. Instead, he reached out. His large, rough fingers brushed against her knuckles, a feather-light touch. You were wrong, Elias said softly. Joe looked up at him. About what? You ain't a coward, Elias said. The woman I just watched? She's the bravest damn soul in Kansas. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked out the back door, leaving Joe standing alone in the kitchen, her heart hammering a wild, unexpected rhythm against her ribs. Winter did not announce itself in Kansas. It kicked the front door open. By the second week of November, the ambergrass nuts turned brittle. The dirt froze solid, and then the sky turned the color of an old iron skillet. The blizzard hit just after sundown. It wasn't just snow. It was a white, screaming wall of ice and wind. It rattled the window panes. It found every crack in the farmhouse walls, breathing bitter frost into the hallways. Elias went out to the barn at 8 o'clock to check the herd. By midnight. He had to come back. Joe sat in the kitchen. The fire in the Monarch stove was roaring, eating cordwood as fast as she could feed it. She had a pot of coffee boiling, waiting. At 1 in the morning, a small shadow appeared in the doorway. Abigail. She was wrapped in a quilt, her bare toes curling against the cold floorboards. Joe, the little girl whispered. Her voice trembled. Not from the cold, from fear. Pa isn't back, and the red heifer, she was supposed to calf this week. Joe looked at the clock on the mantel. 5 hours in a blizzard. A man could freeze to death walking 20 yards from his own front door in a storm like this. It happened every winter. Folks got turned around, lost in the whiteout, froze solid, just out of reach of their own porches. Joe didn't hesitate. She didn't wait for Matthew to wake up. She stood. She pulled on her heaviest wool skirt. She grabbed Elias' spare canvas coat from the peg. It swallowed her whole. She put on a pair of leather work gloves and tied a wool scarf tightly around the lower half of her face. She grabbed the oil lantern. Stay by the stove, Abby, Joe ordered. Keep the fire hot. Joe pushed the back door open. The wind hit her like a physical blow. It drove the breath right out of her lungs. The cold was an absolute terror. It bit into her skin like ground glass. She couldn't see the barn. She couldn't see her own boots. There was a rope tied from the porch rail to the barn door. Elias had rigged it up yesterday. Joe grabbed the frozen hemp. She pulled herself forward. Step by step. The snow was already up to her knees. Her thighs burned, her lungs ached, but she kept moving. Implicit value. She wasn't a fragile ornament anymore. The house was hers to protect. The family was hers to protect. She walked into the storm because that was what partners did. She reached the barn. She shoved her shoulder against the heavy sliding door, barely moved. The wind fought her. She gritted her teeth, planted her boots, and shoved with everything she had. The door cracked open just enough. She slipped inside. The wind howled behind her, but the barn was a different world. It smelled of wet wool, sweet hay, and raw panic. The air was thick, warm with the body heat of 40 head of cattle. Joe held up her lantern. At the far end of the barn, in a large birthing stall, a lantern cast a dim yellow circle. Joe hurried down the center aisle. Elias was on his knees in the straw. His coat was off. His flannel shirt was soaked with sweat and blood. In front of him lay the red heifer. The animal was panting hard, her eyes rolling back in her head, letting out a low, agonizing bellow. Elias looked up as Joe approached. His face was pale, exhausted. He didn't ask why she was there. He didn't tell her to go back to the house where it was safe and clean. "She's dying," Elias said flatly. "Calf is breached. Back legs are stuck. I can't turn it. My hands are too big. I can't get deep enough to find the joint. A cow and a calf. That was meat for the winter. That was cash for the spring seed. In Oakhaven, you lost your stock, you lost your land." It was that simple. She stripped off the heavy canvas coat. She unbuttoned her cuffs and rolled the sleeves of her dress up past her elbows. Elias watched her. "Joe, it's bloody work." "I've stitched a man's face," Joe said, her voice steady. "I've studied human anatomy. A joint is a joint. Bone is bone." She walked over to the water bucket. The top was frozen. She smashed the ice with the heel of her boot, plunged her bare hands into the freezing water, and grabbed a sliver of lye soap. She scrubbed her arms up to the elbow. Then she stepped into the stall, into the muck, into the blood and the afterbirth. She knelt right beside Elias in the wet straw. "Tell me what to feel for," Joe said. Elias didn't hesitate. He didn't let his male pride stop him from taking orders from a woman. He gave her the space, implicit value, trust, absolute, unflinching trust in her competence. "Reach in," Elias said, his voice low, coaching her. "Find the hock, the knee joint on the back leg. You have to push the calf back inside her just a few inches. Give yourself room. Then cup the hoof. Don't let it tear the mother. Bring it forward." Joe took a breath. The smell was overwhelming. Tight, the heifer groaned and contracted, squeezing Joe's arm with bone-crushing force. Joe gritted her teeth. She closed her eyes. She stopped thinking about where she was. She thought about the medical textbooks in her father's library. She visualized the skeletal structure. "I feel it," Joe gasped. "I have the joint." "Push back," Elias ordered. Joe pushed. The calf didn't move. She pushed harder, driving her weight forward from her shoulders. The calf slid back an inch. "Got the hoof," Joe breathed. She cupped the sharp, tiny hoof in her palm to protect the mother's uterine wall. "I'm turning it, pulling forward." She worked blindly in the dark warmth. Slowly, carefully, her muscles screamed. "I have one leg free," Joe said, pulling her arm back. She was covered in fluid up to her sep. Elias grabbed a length of soft cotton rope. He reached in, found the leg Joe had freed, and looped the rope around the ankle. "Now the other one," Elias said. Joe went back in. The mother was exhausting. The contractions were getting weaker. "She's giving up," Elias said. His voice was tight. "We don't have much time." "I have the second joint," Joe grunted. Her arms were shaking. The physical toll was immense. She pushed, she twisted. The hoof slipped from her grasp. "Damn it," breathed Joe. Elias, he shifted closer, his shoulders pressed hard against hers. This house ground, sharing his strength without taking over her task. "Wait for the contraction. Let the mother do the heavy work. You just guide it." Waited. The barn was silent, except for the wind screaming outside the walls. Then the heifer's stomach tightened. "Now," Elias said. Joe pulled. She guided the hoof over the pelvic bone. It slipped free. She fell backward into the straw, gasping for air. Elias moved fast. He looped a second rope around the newly freed leg. He braced his boots against the stall boards. He looked at Joe. She was sitting in the dirt, her dress ruined, her arms coated in blood. She looked beautiful. "Grab the rope," Elias said. Joe scrambled forward. She grabbed the cotton rope right behind his hands. "On three," Elias said. "Wait," Elias said, his chest heaving as he held the tension on the rope. He looked at her, directly into her eyes. "They told you in that city that your hands were only good for holding teacups. They lied to you, Joe. Your hands are saving my livelihood tonight. A plow, a rope, a ledger. They don't care if a man or a woman holds them. They only care if the hands are strong enough to do the work. You belong out here with me. Joe felt a hot tear cut through the sweat on her face, not of sadness, of absolute ringing validation. I know, Joe said fiercely. They keep us out of the dirt because they know if we learn how to pull our own weight, we won't need them to carry us anymore. Pull, Elias? 1, 2, 3. They pulled. They leaned back with everything they had. The mother gave one final, earth-shaking bellow. With a wet, heavy thud, the calf slid free. It landed in the straw, a tangled mass of black and white. For 3 terrifying seconds, it didn't move. Elias dropped the rope. He grabbed a handful of dry straw and began rubbing the calf's chest violently, clearing the lungs. Joe grabbed the calf's snout. She used her fingers to clear the thick mucus from its nostrils. Breathe, Joe whispered. Come on, breathe. The calf suddenly jerked. It coughed, a wet, rattling sound. Then it took a huge, shuddering breath. It blinked and let out a weak. The mother lifted her heavy head. She let out a soft grunt. She turned her neck and began to lick the calf. It was over. Elias sat back on his heels. His head dropped forward, his chin resting on his chest. He took a long, ragged breath. Joe collapsed against the wooden boards of the stall. Her entire body ached. Her hands were cramping so hard her fingers wouldn't straighten. The wind still howled outside, but in the stall it was warm, peaceful. Elias reached over to his coat hanging on the rail. He pulled a small metal canteen from the pocket. He popped the cork. He took a long swallow of water. He wiped the mouth of the canteen
with his thumb and he handed it to Joe.
He didn't pour it into a cup for her. He didn't treat her like a lady. He treated her like a ranch hand who had just held the line with him. Joe took the canteen. She drank. The water was freezing, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted. She handed the canteen back. As Elias reached for it, his fingers brushed against hers. He didn't take the canteen immediately. His rough, calloused fingers closed over her wet, shivering hand. He held her hand there, suspended between them. Joe looked up. The lantern oil was burning low, casting long, flickering shadows across Elias' face. The hard lines around his mouth had softened. The walls he had built around himself for 5 years, walls made of grief, stubbornness, and silence, were gone. He looked at her hands, the bruises, the blood, the ruined fingernails. Then he looked into her eyes. He didn't say a word. There was no grand declaration of love, no poetic speech. Western men didn't work that way. His thumb just slowly, gently brushed across the bruised skin of her knuckles. A silent acknowledgement. I see you. I see what you gave up. I see what you are. Joe's breath hitched in her throat. The heat of his touch sent a shockwave straight through her chest. It wasn't the frantic, desperate flutter of a young girl's crush. It was the deep, solid strike of a hammer hitting an anvil. It was real. She didn't pull her hand away. She turned her palm slightly, letting her fingers rest against his. They sat like that in the dirt, covered in muck, surrounded by the smell of birth and hay. While the worst storm of the decade raged outside, they sat in the quiet light, their hands resting together on the cold metal of the canteen. Slowly, the black square of the barn window began to turn a deep, bruised purple. Dawn was breaking. Elias finally pulled his hand back. He capped the canteen. He pushed himself up from the straw. He groaned as his stiff joints popped. He reached a hand down to Joe. She took it. He pulled her to her feet with an easy, powerful tug. He didn't let go of her hand right away. He held it for just a second longer than necessary to help her up. We did good, Elias said. His voice was a low rasp. We did, Joe agreed. Elias picked up her lantern. He picked up his coat. He held the heavy canvas out for her. Joe slipped her arms into the sleeves. Elias pulled the collar up around her neck, shielding her from the cold that waited outside. His knuckles brushed against her jawline. Go back to the house, Joe, Elias said softly. Wash up. Sleep. I'll finish up here. The fire will be stoked when you come in, Joe promised. She walked to the barn door. She pulled it open. The storm had broken. The wind had died down to a whisper. The Kansas prairie was buried under 2 feet of pristine, glittering white snow. The rising sun caught the ice, turning the world into a sea of diamonds. Joe stepped out into the freezing morning air. She was exhausted. She was freezing. She was ruined in the eyes of society. But as she walked the rope line back to the farmhouse, Josephine Sterling realized something profound. For the first time in 41 years, she was exactly where she wanted to be. Spring came to Kansas not with flowers, but with mud. The snow melted fast. The ground turned to thick, grasping clay. It sucked at boots and wagon wheels. It made every chore twice as hard. But it also meant the earth was waking up. Green shoots pushed through the brown dirt. Life was returning, except in the Thornton kitchen. In there, the air was dead. It started with a piece of paper. Elias had ridden into town for the mail. When he came back, he didn't unhitch the horses. He walked straight into the house. His boots left clumps of dark mud on the floorboards. He didn't seem to notice. He stood by the stove. He held a stiff white envelope. The seal of the Oak Haven Bank was stamped in the corner. Joe was peeling potatoes. She stopped the knife. She looked at his face. The The rugged, unshakable calm of Elias Thornton was gone. His skin was gray. His eyes were fixed on the letter. He looked like a man who had just been shot but hadn't started bleeding yet. "Elias?" Joe asked softly. He dropped the paper on the table. He walked out the back door. He didn't say a word. Joe wiped her hands on her apron. She walked over to the table. She, his wife, she didn't have the right to read his mail, but she was his partner. He had told her so in the barn. She looked down. The legal jargon was dense, but Joe knew how to read the law. Immediate recall of outstanding loan balance. Error discovered in the original drafting of the lien, payable in full within 30 days. Total sum, $800, $800. He might as well have asked for the moon. No rancher in Oakhaven had that kind of cash. It was all tied up in land and cattle. If Elias couldn't pay, the bank would seize the ranch. Silas Vance. Vance couldn't buy Elias out, so he was starving him out. It was legal, it was clean, it was utterly ruthless. 2 hours later, Matthew rode in. He had been to the livery to pick up a repaired bridle. He burst through the front door. He didn't look like a boy who had just learned his home was being stolen. He looked like a boy who had just been slapped across the face. "Matthew?" Joe asked, turning from the stove. "What's wrong?" Matthew stared at her. His chest heaved. The respect that he had shown her since the night she stitched his face was gone, replaced by a confused, agonizing betrayal. "Is it true?" Matthew demanded. His voice cracked. Elias stepped into the kitchen from the hallway. He stopped. "Is what true? What Mrs. Vance is telling the whole town," Matthew said, his voice rising, thick with tears. "She was at the mercantile, talking loud, making sure everyone heard." Matthew pointed a shaking finger at Joe. "She said your husband didn't just die. She said he died bankrupt, leaving you with nothing, and she said he had another family, a mistress, children. She said you were a laughingstock, a woman so useless she couldn't even keep her own husband in her bed." The words hung in the air, ugly, poisonous. This was Silas Vance's second strike. Break the man's finances, break the woman's spirit, make Elias ashamed to have her under his roof. Turn the town against them so no one would offer help. Elias looked at Joe. He didn't ask the question, but Matthew did. "Is it true?" Matthew yelled. Joe stood perfectly still. The iron skillet in her hand felt immensely heavy. She set it down on the stove, carefully so it wouldn't make a sound. She looked at Matthew, then at Elias. "It is true," Joe said. Her voice was flat, empty. "Nathaniel died with massive debts. I knew nothing about them until the lawyer read the will. I also knew nothing about the other woman, or her child." She swallowed. Her throat felt full of sand. "I didn't lie to you, Matthew. I just didn't tell you the worst parts of my life because they belong to me, not to Oakhaven." She looked back at Elias. He was staring at her. His face was unreadable. The silence stretched. It pulled tight, like a wire about to snap. Elias was drowning. He was looking at the woman he was coming to care for, and he was looking at the loss of his children's legacy, the bank note, the town's whispers, the sheer, overwhelming weight of the world caving in on his shoulders. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Joe saw that silence and she misunderstood it. She had lived 18 years with a man who cared only for appearances. She saw Elias's silence and she thought it was shame. She thought she was a burden he could no longer carry. "I see," Joe whispered. She untied her apron. She draped it over the back of the chair. "Dinner is on the stove," she said. She didn't look at either of them. She walked past Elias. She climbed the stairs to her room. The click of her door shutting sounded like a gunshot. Joe pulled the small canvas bag from under her bed. It was the one she had bought at the mercantile to replace her ruined leather suitcase. She began to fold her clothes. 3 calico dresses, 2 plain white blouses, a single woolen shawl. That was her entire world now. She wasn't crying, she was just cold, a deep bone-numbing cold. She couldn't stay. Silas Vince was using her to humiliate Elias. If she stayed, the town would never help him. They would cast him out. He would lose the ranch. He would lose his children's future. She had to leave. It was the only way to protect them. The door hinge creaked. Joe turned. Abigail stood in the doorway. The little girl was holding Joe's flour-dusted cooking apron, the one Joe had just left on the kitchen chair. Abigail walked into the room. She didn't look at the canvas bag on the bed. She didn't ask what Joe was doing. She walked up to Joe. She held out the apron. "You forgot this," Abigail said. Her voice was very small. "Oh, Abby," Joe breathed. Her vision blurred. "I didn't forget it. I don't need it anymore." Abigail's grip on the rough cotton tightened. Her knuckles went white. "Yes, you do," Abigail said. "Sweetheart, I have to go away." "No." Abigail stepped forward. She wrapped her arms around Joe's waist. She buried her face in Joe's stomach. She held on with a desperate, terrifying strength. "You can't go." Abigail muffled into the fabric of Joe's dress. "Mama went away. You can't go too. Who is going to teach me fractions? Who is going to make the fire stop smoking?" Joe dropped to her knees. She wrapped her arms around the trembling child. She pressed her face into Abigail's soft hair. The tears finally came. Hot and fast, implicit value. Blood does not make a mother. Biology does not make a family. Care makes a family. Showing up makes a family. Abigail didn't care about St. Louis. She didn't care about banknotes or town gossip. She cared about the woman who taught her that her mind mattered. Abby, Joe, wept quietly. I'm bad luck. I bring trouble with me. Abigail pulled back. She looked Joe right in the eyes. Her small face was fierce. Pa says luck is just dirt blown in the wind, Abigail said, repeating Elias's exact cadence. He says we build our own luck with our hands. The little girl took the apron. She forced it into Joe's hands. She closed Joe's fingers around it. Don't pack it, Abigail whispered. Please. Joe looked at the worn cotton. Stained with grease, dusted with flour, the most valuable garment she had ever owned. She looked at the canvas bag. She didn't put the apron in midnight. The house was completely still. Outside, the spring wind rustled the new grass. Joe sat on the edge of her bed. The canvas bag was packed, except for the apron. It sat on her pillow. A heavy footstep sounded in the hall. It stopped outside her door. A knuckle rapped gently against the wood. Joe! Elias! His voice was low, rougher than usual. Joe stood up. She walked to the door and opened it. Elias stood in the dim light of the hallway lantern. He hadn't changed clothes. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were clear. The heavy, suffocating silence of the afternoon was gone. He looked at the packed bag on the floor. He didn't step into the room. He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe. I'm sorry, Elias said. Joe shook her head. You have nothing to apologize for, Elias. It's my past that's dragging you down. Vance is using me to shame you. If I leave, maybe the town will extend you credit. Maybe... Stop. Elias cut her off, not with anger, with a quiet absolute certainty. Silas Vance wants my land, Elias said. He'd use the weather, he'd use the bank, he'd use the devil himself if it got him my water rights. You are just an excuse. You are not the cause. He looked down at his boots. Then he looked up at her. I didn't speak in the kitchen because I was judging you, Elias said slowly. The words seemed hard for him to pull out of his chest. I didn't speak because I was terrified. Joe frowned. Terrified of what? The $800? Elias stepped halfway into the room. I can fight a bank. I can fight a drought. I know how to do that. He took a slow breath. I'm terrified because I sat at that table and I realized that if you walked out that door, the house would be empty again. I realized I need you here. Not to cook, not to do the ledgers. I need you. Joe's breath caught. When Clara died, Elias whispered, his voice cracking on his late wife's name for the first time in 5 years. It gutted me. I promised myself I would never let anyone close enough to hurt me like that again. I built a wall. I made my world small. Just the work. Just the kids. He reached out. He didn't touch her. His hand hovered just inches from her arm. You broke the wall, Joe. You didn't even try to. You just walked in, set the kitchen on fire, saved my daughter, stitched my son, and you broke it. And today, when I saw that bag in your hand, I felt that old grief waking up. He dropped his hand. He looked her dead in the eye. I was a coward this afternoon, Elias said, but I'm here now. Do not leave this house because you think you aren't wanted. Do not let Silas Vance tell you where you belong. Joe looked at this massive, rugged man, stripping his soul bare in a dark hallway. She reached down. She grabbed the canvas bag. She opened the latch. She tipped it over. Her clothes spilled onto the floor. I'm staying, Joe said. Elias let out a breath that sounded like a prayer. He nodded once. He turned and walked down the hall. The sun came up hard and bright the next morning. Stairs. Joe walked downstairs. The fire was already lit. Elias was out in the barn. She walked to the kitchen table. The bank letter was still sitting there. A death warrant printed. Joe sat down. She poured a cup of black coffee. She pulled the letter closer. She read it. Not as a cook, not as a frightened widow. She read it the way she used to read the heavy leather-bound books in her father's secret library in Philadelphia. She read it as a legal scholar. She traced the lines of ink with her finger. Pursuant to the terms of the private charter, she frowned. She read the header, Oak Haven First National. She read the fine print at the bottom of the page, Federal Banking Act of 1864. Joe's eyes widened. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. A slow, sharp smile spread across her face. Silas Vance was a greedy man, and greedy men got sloppy. An hour later, Joe drove the wagon into Oak Haven alone. She didn't wear a bonnet to hide her face. She sat straight on the wooden bench. She parked the wagon right in front of the brick bank building. She tied off the horses. She walked inside. The bank was quiet. Marble floors, brass teller cages. Silas Vance was sitting in his glass-walled office at the back. He looked up as Joe walked in. He smirked. He probably thought she was coming to beg, to ask for an extension on behalf of her employer. Joe pushed the glass door open. She didn't wait to be invited in. She walked right to his heavy oak desk. Mrs. Sterling, Silas said, leaning back in his leather chair. He steepled his fingers. I assume you're here to pack your things and catch the eastbound train. A wise choice. The Thornton Ranch won't be able to pay your wages much longer. Joe didn't sit down. She reached into her apron pocket. She pulled out the bank letter. She dropped it flat on his desk. "I'm here about this piece of fiction," Joe said. Silas chuckled. A patronizing, ugly sound. "Fiction? That is a legal writ of collection, my dear. I wouldn't expect a woman whose primary concern is the temperature of an oven to understand the complexities of finance. Time to strike!" Joe leaned forward. She placed both hands flat on his desk. "The law," Joe said, her voice dropping into a register of cold, absolute authority, "does not distinguish between men and women, Mr. Vance. It only distinguishes the righteous from the criminal. And a woman's intellect does not burn to ash." Silas' smirk faltered. "Just a fraction." Joe tapped the paper with her index finger. "You cited a private charter clause to recall this loan early," Joe stated, her words clipping along with deadly precision. "A clause that allows a private lender to demand payment upon discovery." Very clever, however. She leaned closer. "Elias Thornton signed this loan with Oak Haven First National, which, as your letterhead proudly displays, is a federally chartered institution. Under the National Bank Act of 1864, federally chartered banks are prohibited from employing private charter recall clauses. Doing so constitutes predatory lending and violates your federal charter." Silas Vance went completely still. The color drained from his face. "If you attempt to foreclose on the Thornton Ranch using this document," Joe continued, her voice echoing in the quiet office, "I will personally wire the federal banking regulators in Chicago. I will provide them with this letter. They will audit your books, they will revoke your charter, and you will lose this bank." Silas opened his mouth. No sound came out. He looked at the woman in the calico dress, the flower on her sleeves, the calluses on her hands. He had tried to fight a farmer. He didn't realize he had picked a fight with a jurist. You're bluffing," Silas stammered. "Am I?" Joe asked. She stood up straight. She looked down at him. "Try me, send the sheriff, see what happens to your empire." She reached down, picked up the letter, and folded it neatly. She tucked it back into her apron pocket. "The loan will be paid according to the original, agreed-upon 5-year schedule, Mr. Vance, not a day sooner. Have a pleasant morning." Joe turned around. She walked out of the office. She walked across the marble floor. She stepped out into the Kansas sunlight. The wind caught her hair. She had lost her husband. She had lost her wealth. She had lost her social standing. But as she climbed back into the wagon and picked up the reins, Josephine Sterling knew she had found something infinitely more valuable. She had found her own power. She snapped the reins. The wagon rolled toward home. The dust settled in Oak Haven. Not the dirt on the street, the invisible dust, the heavy, suffocating cloud of impending ruin. Silas Vance didn't send the sheriff. He didn't ride out to the ranch. He just went quiet. A bully with a broken nose usually does. May brought a fierce, bright green to the prairie. The calves were growing loud and strong. Elias was in the loft of the barn. It was a Saturday afternoon. The air up there was thick. It smelled of old hay, leather rot, and time. He was looking for a spare block and tackle. He moved a stack of canvas tarps. Behind them sat a small wooden box, cedar wood. Brass hinges, tarnished green around the edges. Elias stopped. His breathing slowed. He hadn't seen that box in 5 years. He had packed it away the day after the funeral. Clara's things, the small, meaningless items that suddenly meant everything when the person was gone. He knelt in the dust. He ran a rough thumb over the lid. Footsteps sounded on the wooden ladder. Light. Quick, Abigail popped her head over the floorboards. "Pa, Joe says dinner is almost." She stopped. She saw the box. She climbed up the rest of the way and walked over. She knelt beside him. "Is that Mama's?" Abigail asked. Her voice was hushed, reverent. Elias swallowed hard. "Yeah, Abby, it is. What's inside?" 5 years ago, he would have sent her down the ladder. He would have locked the grief away in a dark room and swallowed the key. But things were different now. The walls were cracked. "I don't rightly remember," Elias said softly. He undid the brass latch. He opened the lid. It wasn't jewelry. They hadn't had the money for that. It was paper. Letters, dried prairie flowers pressed between pages of a small leather-bound journal, a tortoise-shell comb. Abigail reached out. She touched the comb. "It smells like lavender." Elias nodded. He pulled out the stack of letters. They were tied with a faded blue ribbon. He recognized Clara's handwriting. Looping, careful. But they weren't addressed to her family back east. They were addressed to him, to Elias S. He frowned. He untied the ribbon. He opened the top letter. It was dated a month before she died, when the fever had already taken root in her lungs, when she knew. He began to read. "My dearest Elias, I am writing this because I know I cannot say it to your face. If I try, you will tell me to rest. You will tell me I am getting better. You will refuse to hear the truth because you are a stubborn man. It is one of the things I love about you, but it is also the thing that will hurt you the most." Elias felt a cold ache form in his throat. "I know I am leaving you, and I know what you will do. You will lock your heart away. You will decide that duty is enough. You will raise the children, and you will work this land, and you will punish yourself for not being able to save me. Elias closed his eyes. The paper trembled in his calloused hand. Do not do it, Elias. Grief is not a debt you pay with the rest of your life. You are a good man, a warm man. But you have always believed you only deserve the hard things in this world. You are wrong. He opened his eyes. He read the last lines. The ink was slightly smudged, as if a tear had fallen on it before it dried. When the time comes, when the house feels too quiet, please, my love, let someone else in. Promise me you will not turn to stone. You deserve to be happy again, and the children deserve a father who knows how to smile. Do not let my death be the end of your life. Let it go. Yours always, Clara. Elias stared at the paper. The silence in the loft was absolute. For 5 years, he had worn his widowhood like an iron collar. He thought he was honoring her by suffering. He thought that if he ever felt joy, if he ever wanted a woman again, it would be a betrayal. But Clara had known him better than he knew himself. She wasn't asking him to forget her. She was setting him free, implicit value. True love does not trap. It does not demand eternal misery as proof of devotion. It unties the knots of the past so the future can breathe. Elias sharing this moment with the memory of his wife was the ultimate act of healing. A small hand touched his arm. Abigail was looking up at him. Her blue eyes were wide, worried. Pa, you sad? Elias looked at his daughter. He saw Clara in the shape of her jaw, but he saw something else too. He saw a little girl who had spent 5 years tiptoeing around a ghost. He pulled Abigail into his chest. He wrapped his big arms around her. No, Abby, Elias whispered into her hair. His voice was thick, but it was steady. I'm not sad. I think I'm finally awake. He held her for a long minute. Then he let her go. He folded the letter carefully. He put the rest of the things back in the box, but he kept that single piece of paper in his hand. Go on down and wash up, Elias said. Tell Joe I'll be there in a minute. Abigail nodded and scrambled down the ladder. Elias sat in the dust for a moment longer. He looked at the paper. The invisible weight that had sat on his chest for half a decade lifted, completely, gone. He climbed down. He walked across the yard. The sun was setting, turning the Kansas sky into a canvas of violently beautiful orange and purple. He walked into the kitchen. Joe was at the stove. She was turning a piece of salt pork in the iron skillet. She wore the flour-dusted apron, the one Abigail had begged her not to pack. She looked over her shoulder. She saw his face. She set the wooden spoon down. She turned fully toward him. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just waited. Elias walked over to the table. He set the letter down on the scrubbed pine boards. Read it. Joe stepped closer. She looked at the old paper. She looked at Elias. This is private, Joe said softly. It's not my place. It's your place, Elias said. His voice left no room for argument. Read it. Joe picked up the letter. She read it silently. Elias watched her face. He watched her eyes track back and forth across Clara's handwriting. He watched the slight parting of her lips as she reached the final paragraph. When she finished, she carefully placed the letter back on the table. She smoothed the crease with her fingertips. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't say, I'm so sorry. Instead, she looked up at him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. She loved you enough to let you go, Joe said quietly. That is the rarest kind of grace, Elias. Most people use their pain as a weapon to keep others tied to them. She used hers to cut your chains. Elias took a step closer. He was standing right in front of her now, close enough to smell the wood smoke in her hair. I thought I was doing right by her, Elias said. His voice was a low rasp. By staying empty. I thought if I needed anything for myself, it made me a selfish man. Joe reached out. She didn't hesitate. She placed her hand flat against the center of his chest, right over his heart. You are the most selfless man I have ever known, Joe said. But you cannot pour from an empty cup. You have given everything to this land, to your children. Even to me, a ruined stranger you pulled out of the dirt. She stepped slightly closer. It is not a crime to want a life of your own, Elias. It is the only way to truly live. Elias looked down at her. He looked at the sharp intelligence in her eyes, the quiet, fierce strength that had faced down Silas Vance, the gentle hands that had delivered a calf in a blizzard and stitched his son's torn face. He didn't make a grand, poetic speech. He just reached up and covered her hand with his own. He pressed her palm harder against his chest. I'm done being empty, Joe, Elias said. He didn't lean in to kiss her. That wasn't what this moment was about. This was about a foundation being poured, solid, unbreakable. He held her hand against his heart, and he let her feel it beating, strong, steady, alive. Mid-morning, the sun was warm. The sky was an endless, aching blue. Elias was out by the north pasture. He was fixing the fence line. It was hard, relentless work, digging post holes, stretching barbed wire, blood and sweat. Joe walked over the rise. She was carrying a tin cup of hot coffee. She wore her blue calico dress. The hem was muddy from the walk. She didn't care. Elias saw her coming. He dropped the post hole digger. He pulled off his leather work gloves and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. He walked over to the fence line to meet her. She handed him the cup, the steam curled up in the crisp air. "Thank you," he said. He took a long drink. He leaned his forearms against the top rail of the wooden fence. He looked out over the pasture. The new calves were running in the tall grass. The land was green. It was healing. "I got an offer from the bank in Topeka yesterday," Elias said, staring out at the herd. "They heard about what happened with Vance. They offered me a clean line of credit. 5 years. Fair interest. Said they prefer the." Joe smiled. A small, satisfied smile. "Imagine that." Elias turned his head. He looked at her. "This land is good," Elias said. "It's hard. It will break you if you don't respect it, but it gives back what you put into it." "I know," Joe said. Elias set the tin cup down on the fence post. "I need someone to help me run it," Elias said. Joe raised an eyebrow. "I already cook 3 meals a day, wash your clothes, teach your daughter fractions, and audit your ledgers, Mr. Thornton. What else do you want me to do?" Elias turned fully toward her. "I don't want to cook," Elias said, "and I don't want a hired hand." He reached across the fence. He took both of her hands in his. His grip was firm, calloused, real. "This land needs someone standing beside me to protect it," Elias said. "A servant, not a shadow, not a wife who sits in the parlor and waits for the men to make the decisions." He squeezed her hands. "It needs an equal owner. It needs you." Joe stared at him. Her heart hammered a wild rhythm against her ribs. For 18 years her previous husband had introduced her as his wife. An extension of his property. A reflection of his status. Elias Thornton was offering her something completely different. He was offering her sovereignty. He was offering her a partnership where her mind was valued as much as her heart. "An equal," Joe whispered. "In all things," Elias promised. His gray eyes were intense, unwavering. "I will never silence you, Joe. I will never ask you to shrink. You stand as tall as you want on this dirt. Will you stay?" Joe didn't look down. She didn't blush. She looked the man she loved dead in the eye. "I will," Joe said. The wedding was small. They held it in the tiny wooden church in Oakhaven on a Tuesday morning. White lace, no elaborate bouquets. Joe wore her best blue dress, the color of the Kansas sky. Matthew stood beside his father. He wore a stiff suit. His hair was slicked back. The scar above his eye was a thin white line. He stood tall, proud he wasn't a boy anymore. Abigail held Joe's hand as they walked down the short aisle. She carried a handful of yellow prairie asters she had picked that morning. Nobody told her to do it. She just wanted to. There were no town elites in the pews. Silas and Margaret Vance were notably absent. But the mercantile clerk was there. The blacksmith was there. The people who worked with their hands. When the preacher asked for the vows, Elias didn't repeat the standard obedient lines. He held Joe's hands. He looked at her bruised knuckles. "I promise to honor your mind," Elias said, his voice echoing in the quiet church. "I promise to share the work, the grief, and the joy, and I promise I will never be silent when you need an answer from me." Joe squeezed his hands. "I promise to stand beside you," Joe said clearly, "to protect this family with everything I have, and to choose you every single day." Implicit value. A marriage built on mutual respect, not societal expectation or economic necessity. A union of two whole people, not two halves trying to survive. They kissed, not a polite peck. A real solid kiss that grounded them both to the earth. 1881, 3 years later. The front porch of the Thornton Ranch was swept clean. The paint wasn't peeling anymore. The garden was bursting with tomatoes and squash. The farm was thriving. It was late afternoon. The sun was dipping low, casting long golden shadows across the yard. Joe sat in a rocking chair on the porch. She was 44 years old. There were a few more lines around her eyes, a few gray streaks in her dark hair. She had never looked more beautiful. On her lap rested a mass leather-bound book. Commentaries on the Laws of England. She was reading, studying. The circuit judge from Topeka had started sending her his old texts. He had heard about the woman who cornered Silas Vance on federal banking law. He respected a good legal mind, regardless of the gender of the person wielding it. The screen door creaked open. Elias stepped out onto the porch. He was carrying 2 mugs of hot coffee. He handed one to Joe. "Thank you." She smiled, marking her page with a piece of ribbon. Elias sat in the chair next to her. He stretched his long legs out with a tired, satisfied groan. He took a sip of his coffee. "Letter came today," Elias said, reaching into his shirt pocket. He handed her an envelope. Joe took it. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Matthew. He was in his first year at the Law Academy in Lawrence. Joe had written the letter of recommendation herself, calling in a favor from an old contact in St. Louis who owed her father. But Matthew had passed the entrance exams on his own merit. Joe opened the letter. "Dear Pa and Joe, the professors here are tough, but they aren't half as strict as you were with the ledgers, Joe. I got the top mark in constitutional law this week. I thought about what you said, about how the law isn't just rules on paper. It's a shield for the folks who can't fight for themselves. That's the kind of lawyer I'm going to be. Not a banker's pet. Tell Abby I'll be home for the harvest. Keep a horse saddled for me." Love, Matthew. Joe folded the letter. She pressed it against her chest. A profound, quiet joy settled over her. He's going to be a good man, Elias said, watching her face. He already is, Joe replied. Down by the barn, a bell rang. Loud and clear. It was Abigail. She was 12 now. She was ringing the bell to signal the end of the day. But she wasn't just ringing it for the ranch hands. She was ringing it for the Oak Haven Girls' Academy. It was a small one-room building they had erected on the south edge of the property. Joe had bullied, charmed, and reasoned the town council into funding the lumber. Now, 20 girls from the surrounding farms came every day to learn reading, writing, and most importantly, advanced mathematics. Abigail was the star pupil. The legacy of their love wasn't just a successful ranch. It was the uplift of the next generation, breaking the cycle of ignorance and submission. Elias watched his daughter run across the yard, her braids flying behind her. He looked at Joe. He looked at the heavy law book on her lap. They used to laugh at me, Elias said, a low rumble of amusement in his chest. Down at the saloon, they used to say I was a fool for hiring a ruined St. Louis socialite to run my stove. Joe took a sip of her coffee. She leaned her head back against the rocking chair. She looked out at the vast, beautiful expanse of the Kansas prairie. And I count myself lucky every single day, Joe said softly. Her voice carried the weight of a life fully lived. I am lucky that I lost the mansion. I am lucky I lost the money. I am lucky I lost the lie I was living. She turned her head. She met her husband's eyes. Because I learned the truth, Elias, the greatest human freedom is not wealth. It is not social standing. The greatest freedom is the right to choose your life all over again, no matter your age, no matter how far you've fallen. She reached across the space between the chairs. She took his hand. We built this, Joe said. Elias laced his fingers through hers. He held on tight. We did, Elias agreed. They sat together on the porch, holding hands, as the sun finally slipped below the horizon, painting the western sky in brilliant strokes of gold. It was not a fairy tale. It was better. It was real. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.
And there she is, Josephine Sterling, sitting on a porch in Kansas, a law book in her lap, a cup of coffee in her hand, and the setting sun painting the sky gold above everything she built from nothing. 41 years old, widowed, bankrupt, humiliated, $11 in her purse and a one-way ticket to the edge of the known world. By every measure that St. Louis society used to keep score, she had lost. She had lost so completely and so publicly that there should have been nothing left to salvage. But here is the truth that this story wants to leave with you, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Sometimes the life that burns to the ground is not the life you were meant to live. It was only ever the life you were told to accept. Joe didn't fail. She was freed. She just couldn't see the difference until the smoke cleared. Because what this story is really about, underneath the Kansas dust and the cast-iron stove and the blizzard in the barn, is a woman being given back to herself, piece by piece, biscuit by biscuit, stitch by stitch. Every time she built a fire she'd never built before, every time she knelt in the dirt and chose the harder, messier, more honest thing over the comfortable and the familiar, she was reclaiming something that had been quietly stolen from her over 18 years of silence. And what Elias Thornton showed us, this hard, grieving, word-poor man who built a shelf 3 inches lower in the dead of night without saying a word about it, is that the deepest form of love is not the love that rescues. It is the love that respects. It does not say, "Let me carry you." It says, "I see what you're capable of, and I refuse to stand in your way." He didn't hire a cook. He recognized a partner. And that single act of recognition, paying her a man's wage, trusting her with his ledgers, stepping back in a courtroom so she could speak, said more about his character than 1,000 pretty speeches ever could. Matthew taught us that anger is often just grief wearing armor, that the most frightening thing for a young man isn't the physical fight, it's the emotional one. The moment he sat in that chair and let a woman stitch his face and speak plainly about his pain, he stopped being a boy trying to perform toughness and started becoming a man capable of real strength. And Abigail, sweet, fierce Abigail, taught us that children do not need perfection from the adults in their lives. They need presence. They need someone who looks them in the eye and tells them that their mind belongs to them, that a quarter of an acre is a quarter of an acre, regardless of who is measuring it. But perhaps the lesson that echoes the longest, the one that will follow you out of this story and into your own life, is this: You are never too old to start over. You are never too fallen to stand back up. The greatest human freedom is not the freedom that comes from having everything. It is the freedom that comes from losing what was never truly yours and discovering, in the wreckage, what actually is. Jo lost a mansion. She found herself. She lost a name. She built a legacy. She lost the comfortable lie, and in its place, she found the difficult, beautiful, aching truth. That a life lived on your own terms, on your own dirt, with your own calloused hands, is worth more than every silk dress ever sewn. We build our own luck. That is what Elias Thornton believed, and by the time this story ends, it is what Josephine Sterling proved.